Mike Tveite has been a consultant for the past 10 years, working with a wide variety of organizations in education, manufacturing, retail sales, insurance, information systems, mining, municipal governments. Recently, he became a member of what's called the Tetrad Group, which was formed when 4 individuals, including Mike, decided that instead of working independently, they would attempt to form a system whose aim, you'd be interested to know, is to learn, to have fun, and to make a difference, not only in their own lives, but for their clients. Mike's a valued member of OQPF's advisory board, as well as the advisory board for the Deming Scholars MBA program at Fordham University. Mike is highly respected for his constancy in learning, applying, and sharing with others the teachings of Dr. Deming. He has an AB in mathematics and a master's and PhD in statistics, and prior to his consulting work, he taught courses in statistics and probability at St. Olave's College in Northfield, Minnesota. I know him to be exemplary, both as a teacher and in the model of Dr. Deming, a lifelong learner. Dr. Michael Tveite.
Thank you, Ben. A couple things to begin with. The first thing is the aim for the Tetrad group, which is this group of people that I work with now. It sort of came about 2 ways. The first thing we did is we were having a meeting at the beginning of the year. It was the 2nd of January, and it'll be relevant for another reason later on in the talk. But one of the guys there was saying, you know, my aim is to enjoy every part of my life just as much as the rest. So he said, I want to have as much fun when I'm doing my work as when I'm at the cabin or when I'm playing golf. Now, admittedly, that would take an increase in the enjoyment quotient while playing golf, but you know, we can work on that. So that is sort of one of the seeds of it. And another thing we did is we talked about, you know, what is really our aim. We spent some time, we did Post-it notes, we did affinity diagrams, we did all the good stuff. And then one of the guys was trying to articulate it and write it in a statement. And he wrote one statement after another, and I kept throwing darts at the statements and saying, yeah, but you know, I don't like these words, and now it's too long. And then I reminded people how Dr. Deming started his seminars. So maybe with gratitude and also apologies to Dr. Deming, we absconded with those 3 little phrases, because that's our aim, is we want to learn, have fun, and make a difference. And the reason that's relevant is that's also the aim here today. I want to learn, have fun, and make a difference. So we're going to do this a little bit differently. I've been debating whether I was really going to confess this to you or not. I sometimes am not always so generous in categorizing talks I've attended. You know, and one of the labels that could be attached to this talk is tastes great, less filling. You know, kind of like Chinese food, it might be kind of fun, but you might leave and say, well, what was really there? I hope you don't leave with that. There are no really new ideas at all in what I'm going to be talking about today. Now, somebody was proposing last night that there aren't many new ideas. But for me, there have been some really new insights in this last year. As I've been working, I think I've learned some really important things. Things I probably at one level knew, but I've learned them in a different way. And I chose to summarize them with this title. Now, I want to give you a little context for the title, Management's Prediction, Not Playing Games. So it's a quote from the New Economics that Dr. Deming, well, he used to say it in lots of his seminars. And I'm going to read a little bit of context for you from New Economics. This is about the whole idea of who are the best workers in the red beads experiments. And so there's just like a couple short paragraphs starting on page 162 in the New Economics. What was wrong with the wonderful idea to keep the place open with the best workers? What the management meant implicitly was best in the future. 3 workers were the best in the past. They won the game, past tense. When retained on the job, they turned out to be a disappointment, blasted management's hopes. They had no more chance to do better in the future than any other 3 workers. It was inevitable that 3 of the 6 willing workers would be the top 3. The 3 best workers in the past had no more chance than any other 3 to do well in the future. And the quote he gives here is, management is not playing games, management is prediction. And he says, so stated in 1987 by me. I didn't realize that the reference was there. I wasn't going to cite the reference, partly because I'm not sure I ever said it. Dr. Deming was very generous with his giving credit, and I think that I must have said something that made him think that. And so he gave me credit for having told it to him. So I'm not sure whether I did or didn't say it, but I don't remember distinctly having said it. So I guess I didn't realize it was important if I did say it. I guess if you talk enough, every once in a while you say something that's valuable. So this talk's going to contain experiences from several parts of my life, and I think it's about basics. You know, they talked to John Wooden about what's important when you're teaching people about basketball, and they were talking to him about not having closed practices. John Wooden was a famous basketball coach at UCLA for a long, long time, and set all sorts of records that probably won't ever be broken in terms of winning percentage and other measures of success. And somebody said, well, why don't you close your practices? And he said, well, because nobody would see anything that surprised them in our practices. We start our practices by looking at everybody's shoelaces and making sure the shoes are tied nice and tight. And then we do bounce passes, and then we do chest passes, and then we do layup drills. And we make sure we cover the basics. We do the fundamentals. And we got to pay attention to the fundamentals. And I would tell you that I believe this is a fundamentals kind of thing today we're going to be dealing with. So this is, again, it's based on some insights I believe I've gotten, and I want to create a forum. I hope to create a forum so that we can talk about them together. The outline for the talk is, they're actually a bunch of bullets, but I would call your attention to the ones in the middle, the obligatory ones at the beginning and end are there, but the ones in the middle, I see sort of three core ideas I want to talk about. Prediction and a model for improvement, prediction and explanation, and then the idea of prediction and goals. And I have, for each of these, a story or stories, case studies, if you will, although that's sort of a highfalutin term probably for what some of these are, that illustrate some of my learnings about these topics. And again, I won't pretend that anything's revolutionary here, but it's been some stuff that's really been important to me in this last year. So the first one we're going to talk about, well, and then this fifth bullet, prediction in our reality, is sort of a caution. It's sort of a, that's what it is. It's a cautionary note. Now what my idea is, I'm going to present a little bit about each one and then talk about some stories, some case studies, and then I'm going to invite you, if you have anything you want to share, any stories you feel compelled to share, because especially in this kind of a talk, when I'm sitting in the audience, I say, oh, I'd love to tell them about this. Now maybe some of you, given that there are a number of people here, wouldn't love to stand up and tell people about it, but if you would, I'd invite you to, as I'm finishing the stories about that piece, go to one of the mics and tell a story, as long as you can do it at a microphone and keep it under a couple minutes. Keep it a couple minutes or under. All right? So the first one I want to talk about, well, I guess before I get to that, I want to talk a little bit about some quotes from Dr. Deming about prediction. Now, this is a slide, it just says management's prediction. I don't have the playing games part on there. This slide isn't in your materials. There are just a few slides in your materials, and those are pretty much the slides I'll use today. I have a couple slides with data that, well, one of them's a kind of personal one, and I just assume not leave it with all of you, and another one is a client one, and I guess I did leave you with a summary of those data. But quotes from Deming about prediction, he says, the theory of knowledge teaches us that a statement, if it conveys knowledge, it predicts future outcome with risk of being wrong, and that it fits without failure observations of the past. Now, if you were in here last night, I think you heard Ian say the same thing. I think that he read pretty much that same quote. He says, without theory, any prediction and any decision based thereon is risky. And then finally, rational prediction requires theory and builds knowledge through systematic revision and extension of theory based on comparison of predictions with observed short-term and long-term results that arise from alternative courses of action. That one's kind of a mouthful. But the idea is we should be learning and increasing our degree of belief in our predictions. So, prediction and a model for improvement. As I want to talk about this, I first want to talk about what I mean by a model for improvement. The model for improvement that I use is it's a simple three-question model for improvement that many of you probably recognize. It was developed by the Associates in Process Improvement, which is a group consisting of Tom Nolan, Lloyd Provost, Ron Moen, Jerry Langley, and, Kevin Nolan, and I probably left out at least one or two people, but they're the folks, I think, that developed this in the form that I use it. And it consists of 3 questions. What are we trying to accomplish? How will we know that a change is an improvement? And what changes can we make that will result in improvement? I think those are 3 very important questions. And I find that in my work, I often neglect to answer 1 or 2 of those questions. I mean, usually I'm not doing much if I'm not answering any of them. But in my work, I often find that there's 1 or 2 that don't go addressed as well as they should. So I find this to be an incredibly powerful tool to work with organizations and to guide my own work. And I can ask this at any level. I mean, if you're a senior management group saying, let's work on our strategic plan for this organization, you should be asking these 3 questions, right? What do we want to accomplish as an organization? How will we know that a change is an improvement in our organization? And what changes can we make? So if you have a strategic planning model that forgets to address these questions, I think you should rethink it. So this impact can be great. There's an organization, this is one of the compelling things that's happened to me in the last 8 months, in fact. There's an organization that I've had the privilege to be involved with over the last 8 months to a year that has a really kind of neat culture. It's a relatively small organization, about 300 people. I guess it's all relative, right? If you're in General Motors, that's a very small organization. For some of you, that might sound big. But there are about 300 people in this organization, and it's an organization that's been around for 15 years or so, and their business is related to cutting-edge technology kind of stuff. And they're an organization that has done a very good job fostering trying things. They have a very safe environment for taking risks in terms of trying new things. So people aren't afraid to try to innovate, sort of the opposite of what John Whitney was talking about this morning. So they're not afraid to try, but they just haven't been very successful in a lot of their attempts. And we introduced this model along with a couple other things. One of the things we talked about was, especially as we're looking at the Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle, which I'll talk about, which if I'm sure you've seen this before, and I don't think you have a slide of this, but this is in the New Economics. When Dr. Deming talked about PDSA, he talked about planning a change or test aimed at improvement. And then the do is to carry out the change or test on a small scale. But at the plan stage, there's important things to do. We have to articulate the theory. Now that can really sound imposing to some people and daunting. So what we have really stressed with people is the importance of, at the plan stage, make a prediction. Write down what you think is going to happen when you test it. Now that's not earth-shaking, but it often doesn't happen. People say, oh, this will be a good thing to do. And you say, well, what do you mean by good? What do you expect to happen? So we really emphasize make a prediction of what's going to happen. So the combination in this organization of the discipline of having the model for improvement, which asks all 3 questions, what are we trying to accomplish? How will we know that a change is an improvement? And then what changes can we make? And what predictions do we make about the impact of changes we're going to make? Those things combined for this organization was like opening the sluice gates in a dam. It was amazing. It's been amazing to watch the flood of ideas and the flood of progress that this organization has made with just those little things. Which is part of what's compelled me to say, I'm going to spend my time at the OQPF conference not trying to talk about anything further advanced, but to go back and say, do we understand the importance of these things? I'm not sure I did. I'm not sure in my bones I understood them. So this organization has really taken to heart these ideas, these simple ideas about answering all 3 questions of the model, not necessarily in order, but addressing all 3 questions, and making predictions when we're going to run a change. When we're going to run through a PDSA cycle, make a prediction. We have a yardstick by which we can measure our improvement or our whatever, whether it's improvement or not improvement. I want to talk about And that's really that's as much as anything the substance of this little piece. But I want to talk about a couple examples, sort of some case studies over the years where I've been exposed to some of these things. I have a couple of them I want to talk about here. That one is a mine maintenance safety issue. I worked with a nickel mine in northern Manitoba for a few years, and this mine would do a 6-week shutdown every summer. And about the only people that worked in the mine during the shutdown were maintenance folks. And so one year they had a different theory. They had a different idea about how they would utilize their maintenance staff. This mine had an underground mine, they had an open pit mine, they had a mill, a smelter, a refinery, very different kinds of facilities. And what they did is they took all the maintenance people from all the facilities and put them in one big maintenance pool and would assign teams out of that pool to go to various parts of the plant to work on improvements and bringing stuff up to snuff during the shutdown. And before the shutdown, the safety superintendent said to me, "I'm concerned that maybe we'll have increased injuries with this plan." And I said, "Well, why do you think that's going to happen? Why do you think you're going to have increased injuries?" He said, "Well, because we've got people working with people they're not familiar with. They're not in sort of a working rhythm with them. We've got people working in parts of the plant that they're not familiar with. There are different hazards, different places. And we've got people working in different kinds of equipment than they're used to working with. So those things, those unfamiliarity things, might make this a less safe workplace this summer for these people." And I said, "Well, then why are you doing this?" And he had all these other reasons about why he was utilizing people this way, that he thought the variety would be good for people and that there would be some learning that could go on as people worked with people from other parts of the plant that they didn't normally associate with. And he wasn't willing to back down from those other pieces. He was just concerned. And I said, "Well, is there anything you can do to mitigate this?" And he didn't see anything. And I said, "Well, I guess we should just gather data then. We'll just see what happens, and after the shutdown, we'll talk about it." So I came back after the shutdown and talked to him, and I said, "Well, how was safety? How was the shutdown?" He said, "It was a great shutdown." I said, "Well, how was safety?" And he looked at me like I was from a different planet. He said, "Why would you ask that?" I said, "Well, we had this conversation before the shutdown about you being worried about safety." He said, "Oh, don't worry about that. That wasn't a problem. There's no problem at all with safety of the shutdown." I said, "No problem at all." "Well, you had all these concerns about increased accidents." He said, "Well, we've never had a more safe period, so would you just shut up and quit talking about it?" And I said, "Well, can you tell me why? What reasons do you attribute to this incredible safety record?" He said, "Well, we've talked about that a little, and we decided that it really has to do with a few things. And one of them is that we've got people working with people they weren't familiar with. And they were working in different parts of the plant that they're not familiar with. And they were working on equipment that they didn't know very well, so they weren't taking stuff for granted. And there was no time pressure on them to get the jobs done. They could take the time that was required to do the job right. But see what had happened? Well, first, two things. I mean, isn't it an irony that we can use the same... He could maybe work for one of the political parties. I don't know. But he could take the same data and come up with the same reasons and take the same reasons to justify why safety should be bad or good. Now, there's some people nodding. I mean, you live through this every day, right? My problem was that I didn't get him to commit to what he said beforehand. I didn't get him to write down his predictions and say, okay, what kinds of actions might we take in response to the data that we get? I mean, basically what he did is he denied ever having said the things he said 2 months earlier. Okay? But there was also one factor that was different, and that was the issue of time. And I don't know how many of you are involved in issues of maintenance of equipment, but that is a vital issue. I mean, this is a kind of place where their idea of a preventive maintenance was to fix something the same day it broke down. Right, that's supposed to be funny. I'm of Norwegian descent, and as you know, they talk about Norwegian humor as being an oxymoron. And, I'm also a statistician, so I mean, what in the world can you expect? So now I've lost my train of thought too. You go for a laugh, and then it doesn't work. But the point there was that not only did they not, I mean, they didn't have an opportunity to learn. See, maybe they could have created an environment where they could have created a little more time for people to do maintenance. It might have helped them understand the importance of doing maintenance in a preventive manner. And this is an organization that was still suffering from cost cutting that they'd done a couple years before, and part of the way they cut their costs was they reduced a lot of maintenance personnel because, you know, they're not direct contributors, they're kind of overhead. So that was what they'd done. So that's the mine maintenance story, safety story. And the reason I bring that one up here is they didn't use prediction in the context of a model for improvement. They even have a theory. They even made some predictions. I forced them to make some predictions, but we didn't get a chance to hold them to their predictions. What happened here is something that's called the hindsight bias, our ability after the fact to explain anything that's happened. That's maybe a useful term for you to take home, right? Hindsight bias, because I'm sure you get a lot of that. I was working with an organization, and they were talking about they were organizing in cells, manufacturing cells, and they wanted to get this cell to start doing their own work scheduling. And part of their improvement effort was they made a prediction that they would have to overcome a lot of resistance in this work cell to accepting the responsibility to schedule their own work. And they were reporting on running the cycle and trying to get this going. And what they said is, they said, there was no resistance at all. We were wrong. And then they went on to the next thing. And I said, well, wait a minute, you know, is there anything we can learn from this? So we have to make predictions. We have to be willing to take a step back and learn from them. Another one, which I was just exposed to in this past week, there's an organization I was working with that it's a manufacturing organization. Not all these examples are, but this is a manufacturing organization, and these numbers are not important, but this is a dimension on some characteristic that they're machining. It's a machining organization. And they're machining a dimension, and this dimension has more variation than it used to have. Now, a lot of times people say that, and there's no data. I mean, they have data. They could go back a year and say, you know, there was an operator on this machine that was holding this dimension at like half the variation they have now. And now they have a new operator, and this is the kind of variation they're holding. This new operator is kind of new to this kind of machining. And so somebody said, well, what was the old operator doing that the new operator's not doing? Is there something we can learn from the difference in practices? The old operator's not around. And somebody said, well, yeah, you know, this old operator on a regular basis tightened these bearings. And the supervisor said, no, that's not it. The reason the data used to look better is that the old operator just recorded numbers that were not far from nominal. Now, that's very credible in this organization, because that happens a lot in this organization. They're probably a supplier to some of you in this room. And by the way, so when they send their control charts to you, they look great. Okay? So, but the supervisor said, no, that's not it. And that was it. End of story, right? That was the end of it. His prediction was that wasn't it. Not only was it a prediction, because it was a supervisor saying it was a fact. Well, it would be pretty easy to just test this, right? So they did that. When the supervisor wasn't there, the operators, you know, they tightened these bearings and said, well, let's just see what happens, because obviously it's an easy one to test. And that's what happened. Okay? Makes me think of one of my favorite quotes that Dr. Deming always used to use. He attributed it to somebody else, but I don't even remember who now, and I haven't been able to find the quote. Is he used to say, I'd rather know a little less than to know so much that isn't so. So this is something the supervisor knew. It just wasn't so. So anybody else have any stories about prediction and a model, application of the PDSA cycle or model for improvement you want to share with everybody? Anybody going to leap to their feet and tell us the story? I'll give you a few seconds so you can work on it. Nope. So that's the whole thing. And that's what the slide is that's in your packet, but that's the example. You can think of some examples maybe, but you just don't. Not ready to share them? Okay. You need to go to a microphone, I'm afraid.
PMI in the UK. Working with a client that produces a piece of equipment, and we've done some studies with control charts, and there was lots of variation. And talking with the guys, they said, well, what we really need is a jig that would help in the alignment of this piece of equipment. And the guy said, oh, there's one over there. We used to use it, but the line speed's gone up and all of that. So they started using the jig, and guess what? Variation came down. And the point was that had they used that model you've got and said, what are we trying to achieve? And, well, we're trying to get the line speed up. How will we know whether a change is an improvement? If they'd done that test beforehand and had collected the data with the jig in place, and then said, well, our theory is we could up the line and do without the jig, and they'd done that test, they would have seen that increase in variation, never have removed the jig.
Okay.
So I too find that just, I use it every day in going out to clients, just using that. I find it so powerful.
And related to that, one of the components that I really, thank you for the example, one of the components I really work very hard with people on is they would often say, what are we trying to accomplish? We're trying to make this line more productive, get more out of this line. How will we know that a change is an improvement? One of the dangers is for people just to answer that with one dimension, to say, let's look at line speed. And one of the things you have to do when you answer this question is you have to say, okay, if we understand our system, how will we know that a change is an improvement? You know, maybe it's an issue of variation on the whatever quality characteristic we're measuring, or maybe it's the usability of whatever product or service we're providing to somebody else, or maybe we want to address something about customer response to a change that we make. So one of the keys is not just to answer that second question in one dimension, but to come up with a spectrum of ways to understand it. Okay? Any further comment? Okay, somebody else? Let me just get this warmed up. If somebody else could go to a microphone too and be ready. So.
I think there are some more macro kinds of predictions that reside in business that keep them from making certain changes. The prediction that if you take salesmen off of incentive, they won't sell.
Right.
The prediction that if you take salesmen off of incentives, you'll lose the superstars. Turnover will increase. Those kinds of things are also predictions, and very often the data does not support the prediction, but they're not even willing to take the chance. It's such a strongly held belief that they won't even show up for work if they don't have an incentive. That's what it takes to get a salesperson going.
Right. Thank you.
The data doesn't support it.
Yeah, and it's one of the things that if we don't want to take the risk of being wrong sometimes, so we're not willing to try it. So one of the questions would be, how do you test it on a small scale without actually system-wide taking people off an incentive? How do you do that? And the other part is the presupposition that maybe losing the superstar salespeople would be a bad thing. Maybe in terms of your system, you should rethink that. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad if you lost some of your superstar salespeople. Yeah, I mean, what are they selling and to whom, and what are they doing to the rest of the organization when they do it? So maybe you work better. I mean, you need to ask those questions. Thanks.
I wanted to support your point, Mike, of the importance of people seeing the theory and articulating it in the plan stage, and this is from observations of some new Deming study groups that we're doing in our community that are about 6 months old with people that are new to Deming. We've spent some time focusing on that point of bringing theory is very far away when you start to talk up in the sky. It's Albert Einstein, and bringing it down to Earth, that we're all generating lots of theories, and when we start to look at this model, that a theory could be as simply as, I believe that if we do this, that this will happen, recording it, articulating it, and then what will be. We believe that that's been one of the key breakthroughs of where people have moved.
Okay.
And I think that's very important.
So the importance of theory. And I would say that's vitally important, the use of theory. Now, what I would tell you is that I try a lot of times with people early on not to use the word theory. I say, make a prediction. On whatever basis you have, make a prediction. And then let's back up and ask why. Why are you making that prediction? And you can get them to articulate a theory without ever using the word theory, which can intimidate some people because they don't have an E equals MC squared kind of thing.
Hi, we, at the college where I worked, we found that it took 210 days to hire someone from the time that the position was approved. And we got through the second question, we knew that if we cut the time, that there'd be some improvement because we were losing candidates because of the duration, and we were also having to fill positions with terminal positions, which is bad for morale and creates other problems. So we knew that. Our prediction was we thought it was the committee that was taking a lot of time. But we really didn't know, as far as going to the third step, what changes, we really didn't know. So we spent 18 months tracking the different parts. And what we found out was that the most time was taken after the position was approved up to the time the committee was formed, getting the correct position description and getting the advertisements out and those kinds of things. And the second amount of time was taken with the executives who were trying to make a decision after the committee was probably one of the more efficient parts when we actually laid it out.
Okay.
So now we're actually beginning with a couple improvements. One of them is to have the position announcements ready at the time the job is approved. We think we can cut off 43 days on just that, but we don't know yet. We're just starting out. But it was kind of an interesting position because we really couldn't act because we didn't have data to make a good decision. And if we had gone and put pressure on our committees or something, we might have done the wrong thing.
Okay, thank you. So I'd rather know a little less than to know so much that isn't so. And a big part of using the PDSA cycle is learning or unlearning those things that we know that just aren't so. And so that's what that theory allowed you to do, that prediction allowed you to do. Thanks. Okay. The next piece, I've titled Prediction and Explanation. Now, maybe this one doesn't need any explanation to people. This one, you know, I had a hard time saying what examples do I want to use and which ones don't I want to use because there are, you know, we could spend the rest of the day talking about examples of this one. But I just picked a few of the biggies, and I think that some of your organizations will resemble some of these. One of the first ones is deviation from budget, and I heard this again, you know, just 2 weeks ago. I was in a management meeting. I was just sort of being a fly on the wall for this management meeting, listening to how they do this management meeting. And they do this on a monthly basis, and the financial people came in, and the financial person responsible for each area went through the gross margins, and whenever there was a deviation on the negative side, they didn't feel compelled to explain the positive ones necessarily, but anytime there was a deviation at all on the negative side, they told exactly what happened. Again, you know, you can come up with that explanation. The question I asked them later is, I said, does that give you any basis to predict the future? Because at the end of this meeting, they said, well, okay, you've been quiet for the most part, not completely, but as much as I can. You know, I didn't indulge myself too much, but you've been quiet for the most part for these 3 hours this morning, so what feedback do you have for us about this meeting? And I said, well, there's this deal about reporting on deviations from budget. And you know what the executives said? Oh, we know that's a problem. We know that that doesn't mean anything. And I said, okay, why is it done? Well, we kind of haven't gotten around to doing away with it. I said, get around to it, you know. What kind of messages, you know, they knew that those deviation explanations were meaningless, but what message did they send to the rest of the organization who came up with these, you know, do you suppose that these were painless things to come up with? No, these people invested a lot of time in understanding exactly what caused those deviations. So that's an explanation versus a prediction. A revenues were up last month. There was an organization that I knew that we plotted their revenues on a control chart to try to help them understand something about the basis of their revenues. There are really wide control limits in this organization, probably from, well, there were, let's just say there was almost an order of magnitude between the lower and the upper control limit. There were very wide limits in this. And the data, given those wide limits, were in control. And we shared these data with the top couple people of the organization, and the chief financial officer got a glimmer in his eye, a gleam, and he said, last month we were here. And he pointed out a point that was about 2/3 of the way from the center line to the upper control limit, and I said, that's really nice. And I said, did you predict that before the month started? Well, no, but we were here. And he felt good. I mean, you should feel good about having a good month, right? And I said, so where are you going to be next month? He said, well, of course, we'll be there again. Well, they weren't. So, I mean, that's another case. And I'm sure you're exposed to those things all the time. So this was an easy one to come up with. Another example is a misproduction schedule. Well, it's not even, misproduction schedule is the same deal. Anytime we miss some arbitrary number, stock market variation. Any day at 5 o'clock, you can see an explanation of why the stock market did what it did today, right? How predictive are those explanations? Will they tell you what's going to happen tomorrow? In fact, I heard somebody in one of these shows bemoaning. They were saying the market was up and down all day, but unfortunately, it ended down 1.5 points. Well, what difference does it make? I guess I just live in a different world than these people. There's some that aren't on here that I feel compelled to talk about. One of them is there's a company I know that sells musical instruments. They sell pianos, among other things. And we were in a management meeting, and the piano division had a large inventory of pianos. And somebody asked why that was. And this might have been, I don't know if I had the data, but it could well have been a special cause. And the piano manager sort of hung his head and he said, I made a bad buy. And then they were ready to go on. I said, well, wait a minute, what does that mean, you made a bad buy? He said, well, I bought them and they're still here. That's kind of the definition of a bad buy, And I said, well, given the same opportunity again, would you make the same buy again? He said, without a doubt, in a minute. And I said, okay, you didn't make a bad buy. You made a buy that turned out badly. And he didn't understand there was any difference at all. I mean, he lives in a world of personal accountability, and if something he does turns out bad, it's his fault. There's a difference between making a bad buy and a buy that turns out badly. I mean, if you're buying something over and over and over again, some of them aren't going to turn out that great. There's an organization, this is sort of a variation on the theme, there's an organization I know of that's a distributor. They've got really fancy computer models. These people have tens of thousands of parts they're responsible for buying and selling. They have a really fancy computer model that predicts demand on parts. In fact, they were proud to tell me that they were using 12-factor Fourier series to predict the demands for their parts. And I said, well, can we look at the data on some of these? And they would show data that, to me, I would say if I put a Short control chart on them, they look pretty stable. But their process, based on 2 years of data, by the way, they fit almost every point with this high-level Fourier analysis model. They could predict, what are the two parts of knowledge? Being able to explain the past and predict the future. Well, these models were great at describing the past. In fact, one of them was really an interesting one. I looked at it, and their prediction for next month was 21,000 units. Now, the highest demand they'd had in 2 years was like 12,000 units. The average demand was 7,000 units, and it was a process that had a step up a year ago, but it looked like it was in statistical control since then. And I said, I'll bet anything that next month is a lot closer to 7,000 than 21,000. It was 4,000 the next month. But, I called them the month after that just to see. But see, it reminds me, Dr. Deming used to say, beware of the unmanned computer. I mean, this computer would send buying signals based on its models. And actually, in this thing, they were predicting that demand was going to be going down in the future when we tried to bring subject matter knowledge into it. And as it went down, it would take a long time to get rid of 21,000 units. And inventory turns in a distribution business are really vital. Okay, so that's an example where they let a model try to predict the future without integrating any subject matter knowledge, which is one of my pet peeves, when people try to use statistics or some other modeling method to predict the future without integrating any knowledge about the subject matter. One more story about this that some of you may have heard. Dr. Deming used to tell this story in his 4-day seminars. This is an organization I worked with that was a division of, as Jack said yesterday, a Fortune 1 company. And they made fuel injectors. They made a lot of fuel injectors. They made, like, of one kind of fuel injectors, they shipped 30,000 a day. And they would get about 20 a month back from their customer or their customer's customer saying, these fuel injectors leaked. And along with that, and this was years ago, I'm sure that's not done anymore at this organization, but along with these fuel injectors they get back, there would be a request for root cause analysis. And they would want to know what corrective actions were going to be taken based on the analysis. And somebody had a theory, and they said, well, I'll bet there's contamination in those suckers. That's causing that's plugging it up and causing leakage to happen. And they looked, and they found contamination. And then some bozo said, how many good ones did you take apart and look for contamination? And they said, well, the good ones didn't leak, so why would we do that? Well, they did, just to humor me. And they found contamination in the good ones, too. So trying to explain just focused on one end of the distribution was causing them to do bad things. Now, maybe I'm picking on one organization, but I see corrective action processes in a lot of organizations that are really elaborate. In fact, one organization was bemoaning that it took them too long and took too much effort to respond to all their corrective action requests. And it was taking their engineering resources. And I said, I got an easy fix for that. And they were really anxious to hear because they wanted to save that time. And I said, use a random number generator and randomly pick some reasons out of your computer. And they all turned white. And they didn't like that very well. But my point was that it's probably as valid as anything else they were currently doing. So, in fact, somebody else talked to me about these corrective actions and irreversible, these corrective action things we do and the root cause analysis. A good friend was telling me, she told me she didn't want me to attribute to her. I don't see her out here. I guess I won't say her name. But she said to me, that's often a search for root who. That was supposed to be funny. I guess maybe it's not. So you could come up with these examples all day. Does anybody have any that they feel compelled, that they would like to share, that they would like to talk to people about? Any explanations that are not at all predictive? No? Would I have predicted that? Well, that one was an easy one to come up with a lot of examples for. The last one of these ones that I want to talk a little bit about is the whole interaction between prediction and goals. And I'll explain this more fully in a minute, but I've come to some conclusions in the recent past about some of the things Dr. Deming said about goals. He talked about goals a lot, right? We're going to come up with a couple of those quotes, but some of the conclusions I've come to is that there's a difference between predictions and goals. Now, that's not a very sophisticated conclusion, but some of the nature of the difference, from my perspective, was that goals don't require any knowledge. It doesn't take any knowledge to set a goal. And they may precede methods. However, predictions, now this is maybe using it a little bit more formally, but predictions made with a reasonable degree of belief require knowledge. And I believe that predictions come from understanding methods, and it's really hard to make a prediction until we have a method. Okay. Are goals completely useless? I don't know. Well, what did Dr. Deming say? Did he say that they were completely useless? In New Economics, he said, a numerical goal accomplishes nothing. Only the method's important and not the goal. And the question we should be asking over and over is, by what method? 3 of his favorite words. He also said, everyone has aims, hopes, and plans, but a goal that lies beyond the means of its accomplishment will lead to discouragement, frustration, demoralization. In other words, there must be a method to achieve an aim, and the question again is, by what method? It's another quote from the New Economics. You know, it's funny because the first time I went to a Deming seminar was in September of 1986, and I was having conversations with Ron Moen. Ron Moen was one of the helpers at that seminar, and I was having conversations with him about some parts of Deming's philosophy that I didn't understand or that didn't make sense to me. It seemed obviously wrong. And Ron and I talked about some of these issues at some length. And it was really interesting because Ron said, you know, he attempted to challenge Deming's thoughts on a lot of subjects, but so far, the more he learned, the more right he thought Deming was. And that was his conclusion there. And I think I've understood some more recently about the interplay of goals and methods and predictions than I used to understand. And so I'm going to talk to you about a case study, and it's, you know, maybe this is kind of hokey, but this is sort of from another aspect of my life. I've been talking about work with organizations, managers, and the way managers use data or don't use data, and the way people try to use data or don't use data to improve or not improve things. Well, this one's really close to home because this stems from a personal experience, and I hope it doesn't sound too sappy or too, I hope it's not too weird. But last December, I stepped on the scale one morning, and I weighed more than I'd ever weighed in my life. And I didn't like that, you know, and I felt very unfit. Not just heavy, but I felt unfit in lots of ways. And so I said to myself, I need to work to become fit. I want to become more fit. So what was I trying to accomplish? Well, I wanted to improve my fitness. So how will I know that a change is an improvement? I thought weight would go down. I wouldn't experience shortness of breath on relatively light exertion. And I would generally feel better. Now, I don't know how you quantify generally feel better, but I thought I would know if that was the case. I set that out as a yardstick and said, how do I feel now? And how, I would think I'll know if there's an improvement. I didn't have data to plot on that. And so I asked myself, well, what change can I make that will result in improvement? And one of the things I decided to do, advisedly or ill, was I decided I was going to run a marathon. Because I know something about me, and I tend to be a little bit inertial. And if I didn't have something to pull me out of bed to exercise or to get me to the gym to exercise, I wouldn't do it. So personally, I said, I'm going to set a goal of running this marathon. Well, I didn't think it was a goal. I thought it was just a method to train for it. It says train for and run a marathon. And then I started thinking about it, and I started thinking, well, if you can run a marathon in 4 hours or better, that's respectable. So I thought maybe I'd try to run a marathon in 4 hours. And it was really an interesting thing because what possible use was there of the 4 hours? Well, I knew there was a use. Because then what I did is I went and started reading stuff and saying, well, what is it you need to do if you want to run a marathon in 4 hours or less? I talked to some people. I was planning to run the marathon in June, and this was like the first of the year. And several people said to me, oh, yeah, you can get ready to run a marathon in 6 months. After the fact, there have been several people that have said, you're stupid. Well, they were nicer than that, but what they really said was that's really what they meant. So what's the deal? My goal became to run this marathon in 4 hours. Now, the learning that I had here was that I began saying, I tended to lose sight of what my aim was in the midst of training for and completing this marathon. And I don't want to belabor it, but here's a little of the data that I gathered. I asked myself, well, weight, as the time went on, that's a nice you know, it was a nice graph. It was going the right direction. It's not important if you see the scale or not. But it, you know, I'll tell you this is like 15 pounds, which is, you know, was significant for me, and I wasn't dieting, so you know, it was just the weight was coming off, which was my theory, that if I exercise on a regular basis, you know, I would reduce weight and stuff like that. And now here's the exercise graph, which is a little weird looking. And what I did is I kept track of time spent exercising each week. And there are a few things I want to explain here. It was going along fine. There's a point here. I had oral surgery that week, and the dentist said he didn't want me out exercising for several days. So I didn't, you know, so I lost some time there. And I was a little worried about losing a few days. I mean, this is January. I was worried about losing a few days of training. And so, you know, it was up and down based on how busy I was. But actually, this week is the first time I hurt myself. I ran over 10 miles for the first time, and my ankle had a twinge in it, you know, at the end of the run. And I thought, well, you know, I got the schedule, and I can run through it probably. And so I didn't want to let up because I didn't want to get behind my training schedule. And I ran on it for the next 3 days, and then I ended up sitting out basically for 3 weeks. So actually, I think I hurt myself the previous week, but that's what happened. And, you know, I actually was able to swim and do some other stuff to try to maintain fitness. And then I ran like a whole bunch of days here. I don't know what the details are. But anyway, I managed. This was like I hurt my right ankle, and here I hurt my left ankle, and here I hurt my left knee. And so, yeah, right. You know, I'd never been so unable to walk as since I started trying to get fit. But yeah, I felt a lot better, right? Actually, I did when I was sitting down, you know. But I guess the point was, in the middle of this somewhere, the first couple of these incidents, I forgot that my original intent was to get fit. I mean, that was clearly what I had out in front of me in the first place. But I began to focus on the means as an end. You know, when I put the marathon thing out in front of me as a goal, it became the end, not just a means. Now, should I not set a goal like that? Well, talking to people who know something about running afterwards, I mean, I'd never run before in my life. Several people after the fact told me that you're nuts to try to run that. I went to my physician after the marathon, try to repair the damage I'd done. But he said to me that he would never advise anybody to try to run a marathon if they hadn't been running for a year and a half, which is new information for me. Nobody said that to me up front. Everybody just said, oh, yeah, you can do it in 6 months. So maybe I sought out the advice I was looking for. But the point isn't anything, it really isn't about me in the marathon, except that that's where I really had the learning, that I set a goal. Why did I set the goal now? To create for myself some urgency about exercising. And it did that. It was very successful at that. You know, it got me out of bed, it got me exercising, days I otherwise wouldn't have exercised. If you said to me, I think you should go out and run 13 miles this week, I'd have said, you're crazy. You know, I had run as much as 3 miles at a time before in my life. But, you know, I would have said, you're crazy. So, you know, I learned a lot, I think, about goals. Are they universally bad? This goal did a lot for me. Of course, now what I should tell you is that the marathon went on, you notice that I only had a few minutes of exercise here. And really this week, there was a Sunday that I ran like a 20-mile run, and I hurt myself and was limping for a week and a half. And then this week, the marathon was at the end of this week. So basically, for 3 weeks before the marathon, I didn't exercise at all because I had hurt myself. And then after the marathon, I was completely unable to exercise. I mean, I couldn't even play golf after the marathon. But, you know, so for several weeks, I was completely unable to exercise. So the question is, you know, what did that do to my fitness? So you get the goal and the means mixed up. I mean, that's really a dangerous thing. I mean, and that's my point from this, is that anybody I know who sets a goal, it's going to be an ongoing struggle to keep yourself from switching the goal turning the goal, something you might have as a means, into an end. And that was my problem. Now, you know what? If I'm in the situation that I was in when I ran this marathon, I'll never run a marathon like that again. Now, there are two reasons for that. One is because I hurt myself so badly when I was running the marathon. I finished, by the way. But one of the reasons is because I hurt myself badly. But the other reason that I ran this one is it was my first time, and part of my strategy was not only did I set a goal for myself, I told everybody I knew that I was planning to do this. Because if I'd set the goal for myself and had just not told anybody, it would have been like not setting the goal. So actually, I didn't tell my brothers or my parents until I'd been training for about 2.5 months. I wanted to have a reasonable basis to say that I was going to do this before I told them, because I didn't want to set myself up for ridicule from my family. And of course, they wouldn't have done that. But anyway, so the point of all that was that there's interplay between goals and predictions. Actually, at one point in here, it's even hard to pick it out, but there was one point in here I thought there was a reasonable basis for making a prediction that I would be able to finish. My prediction actually, based on some knowledge, I thought, was that I would finish in 4 hours and 5 minutes plus or minus 15 minutes. So that, actually I made a prediction that wasn't meeting my original goal. See, the goal wasn't so important at that point. But I felt like I'd been running and had enough experience and knew how fast I was running that I could extrapolate to this. That was before I hurt myself the last time, so it didn't really work out that way. But so that was, when I was thinking about talking about goals versus predictions, I was at the point where I was making a prediction. I felt pretty good about it before I'd realized all the damage that using this goal and holding this goal up in front of myself had done to me. So, I mean, it makes you think about some of the stuff Deming had to say about goals. So that's maybe that's a hokey example, but that's an example of this issue of predictions versus goals. Go ahead.
I think that the experiment may be even more important for something else, and that's getting people to understand total cost of things. When people set goals, they largely pick out some method of measurement that they think is important, the reason they set the goal.
Right.
They do the entire calculation with only what they got in pursuit of that goal, and they never deduct from it all of the things that they didn't intend to get. And what your two charts show is the total cost that you spent in order to get that goal. And in business, they do the same thing.
And I would contend that this is only scratching the surface of what the total cost might be.
Absolutely.
I mean, there have been incredible learnings for me in this. But again, that goes back to the point that we often measure things, especially goals, one-dimensionally. Yeah, right. So, go ahead.
Did anything happen to your motivation to run after having run the marathon?
Well, it's funny because I've told some people about this, but the marathon itself was for me such a painful experience that the last, and I don't mean psychologically painful, although it might have been that too. The last 7 miles of this marathon, I kept seeing the scene from the first Rocky movie in my head, where at the end, they're up and these two guys are leaning at each other, both half dead, and some reporters start asking about the rematch, and Apollo Creed says there ain't going to be no rematch. That's what kept running through my head. Now, as time has passed, see, there's a lot of theories that are going on here. I mean, there's still learning that's taking place because of this. After that, I went to see my doctor, who's a runner, and I talked to him about some stuff, because I made a decision that I learned some things about running that I never would have learned before. I mean, I'd never run farther than 3 or 4 miles before in a row. And I have a brother who's a physician. He said, you never need to run more than 3 or 4 miles. You never need to run more than 30 minutes at a time to get sort of optimal aerobic benefit from running. And what I discovered is I hate the first 15 or 20 minutes of every run I go on. But after that, it gets a lot easier, And I love going in 10 and 15-mile runs. There's a lot of benefit that I could accrue from that. I felt like it was good for my soul and good for my mind. I don't want to I don't want to sound like a running weirdo, but what I did decide is that if I could learn to run without damaging myself, I would continue to do it. But I'm not such a fanatic that I'm willing to damage my knees or my ankles long term to do it. I also have, but it reminded me, part of what it reminded me is how good it feels to feel fit. Because in spite of the aches and pains, I felt better than I felt in years. So whether it's running or biking or swimming or whatever, I mean, it's renewed my commitment to staying fit and to exercising. Now that's one corner of my life. I have things I measure about sort of all the parts of my life. So I'm not trying to make it one-dimensional. So I don't know if that answers your question, but over-answers it.
I'm measuring the mileage that my 92 Taurus gets. Does that count?
What's that?
That was a joke. Yeah. What's the
Oh.
difference? What's the difference between when you ask the first question, what is your aim? Do you see that as different than what is your goal? I mean, you're talking about goals now, but we go back to what is the aim? What's the difference?
In this case study, my aim, what am I trying to accomplish? I wanted to be fit. I mean, that was my aim. I wanted to be fit because I found that that it didn't really matter how much I was sleeping. I never felt especially energetic. I mean, that was a big part of it. I felt lethargic, and that's part of what this nebulous I'll feel better piece was. I felt heavy. I didn't like the way clothes fit. I didn't like the way I looked when I looked in the mirror, which is probably something a few of you could relate to sometimes. I don't know. And, so there were things that I said, now what does it mean to be fit for me? And this also has got to fit into the context, obviously, of the rest of my life. I mean, I know people who I don't know if exercise has caused divorces, but I know people where it's almost at that stage where they forget and they don't have balance. So in this case, I wanted to be fit. See, for me, the marathon was just a goal to provide some urgency for me to do something. Okay? Now, that's one of the things that when I read Stephen Covey's book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, one of the things I got out of that I thought was kind of cool is he talks about something he calls Quadrant 2, time management. He says we all have in our heads a scale that says, is something urgent or not urgent? And for many of us, that drives how we spend our time. One of the things that I got out of what he said is, he said we need to introduce another scale that asks, is this important or not important? And so we need to develop the 4 quadrants, and he labels them. He says 1, 2, 3, 4. And if we have these 2 scales, it'll help us make decisions about our lives. And what he says is, many of us are stuck in what he calls Quadrant 1. We work on important, urgent things. But if we're focused on urgent things, we sometimes work on things that aren't even important that are urgent. And he said we need to find ways to not do that. And what he says is, we should focus on trying to do Quadrant 2, time management. Work on things that are important but not yet urgent, because that'll reduce the number of fires we have to put out. Now that sounds fabulous. I have found myself almost wholly unable to do that. One of the ways I recognize that I can make myself work on things that are important but not urgent is I create for myself an artificial sense of urgency. Now that probably sounds stupid, but you know what? As I've seen managers try to get people to work on things, planning exercise, not budget exercises, but forward-looking and planning and doing surveillance of customers and how they're using your product or service and things that aren't pressing them day to day, they almost have to create some kind of artificial urgency to it to get people's attention, because we're so many of us are so reactive. One other reactive thing about this, an interesting thing is I called immediately after this marathon to make this appointment with my physician. And I got to see him 2.5 weeks later. Well, by then, one of my concerns was easing because I could walk again. But the other piece of it was, when I made the appointment and he couldn't see me for 2.5 weeks, I said, I know exactly what I want to ask this physician. Would it be helpful if I sent a letter along, just a brief, less than 1 page, a note specifying what I wanted to talk to him about? And it was like the woman on the phone was absolutely, no, don't send anything. No. Write it down for your own sake, because she probably figured I was feeble-minded, but maybe I am, who knows? But But, you know, for heaven's sake, there's no way a doctor could look at anything that you would send them before you met with them. And it's interesting because I had conversations with my brother, the physician, and he spends his whole day reacting to whatever it's put in front of him. And, you know, I think our society is, you know, really fosters that. So for me, I couldn't, you know, I can't get myself just to say, yeah, over long term, I'll just go exercise when I need to. And one of the things that is falling down for me is, I mean, I read, but I haven't been doing writing that I think I should do. I haven't been trying to put thoughts down and create papers. And, you know, the process of writing a paper is a very valuable process. But I haven't been able to get myself to do it. So now I need to create some artificial deadlines for myself, so I'll do it. I don't know. But, I mean, so the point, I guess, is that the goal for me was important to create an urgency for it. It had that positive effect. It had all sorts of negative ones, though. Any other comments you want to make about this?
Another thing that can be helpful for quadrant 2 management of time is to create ritual.
I'm sorry?
Is to create ritual.
To create ritual.
Deliberately set aside this amount of time.
Right.
I will every Monday, Wednesday, Friday morning run for half an hour or whatever. That something that's a part of a ritual, so that there's a dynamic to that, and kind of self-guilt of not staying with the ritual. And all
Okay.
kind of stuff.
Did everybody hear what Ian said? The idea of creating a ritual. And that's what Covey talks about when he talks about habits. You know, not only are these good intents, but we've got to make them habits. Right. Thank you.
The interesting thing I found about prediction is I headed a team that looked at, I'm an engineer that works in the government, and we write industrial waste permits for industries, and we were deciding to try to, this team was supposed to figure out a better method or an improved method of writing permits, and everyone's predictions were by use of computers, we would save huge amounts of time. So we benchmarked our flow diagrams and compiled times and went through the whole process, and it was very interesting. We determined we could save about 44% of the time, but about 85% of the time we could save was through simple administrative changes. Who handled the paper, how it went through the system, and in fact, I think we're going to struggle to figure out how we can, the few computer needs that we want, justify them, because the time savings we came up with were very small. So it's really interesting about predictions and then finally doing the work and see what your results really come up with.
So maybe you need to do a different study, you know, to be able to justify the computer needs you have.
That's what I told everybody. We're going to have to be creative in the writing of this document so that we can justify someone looking at it and spending the money we want.
Okay, thank you.
Did having a goal reduce your ability to react to these observations that you were hurting yourself?
I'm sorry?
Having the goal reduce your ability to react to the fact?
You know, very definitely the beginning. The first time I hurt myself, I just said, oh, I'll run through this and it won't be a problem. And it just got worse and worse. And I realized that, I mean, and people were telling me this. They were saying to me, listen to your body. I mean, and so you have to, so the point would be, you got to listen to the data that you can take in. And after the first time, I tried not to focus on that goal. I still had a plan, but when the plan started slipping, I just started worrying more. So what I should have done is I should have tanked the marathon and said, I'll run one in October. I mean, that's what I should have done. And I will do that if I ever run another one. I vow to you that I won't run another one when I'm not ready. It was important to me personally, after having said to all these people that I was going to do this, not to just be a blowhard, and well, not just a blowhard, that I come through with some of the stuff that I say I'm going to do. So that was an important personal thing. You know, I'm sorry if this has turned into a running thing. I didn't mean it to be, but you know, it was a case study for me that had incredible learning opportunities, and I'm still learning from it. You know, I've run twice in the last 2 months, but you know, my next steps are to learn more about why I hurt myself, so I can try not to do that. So I mean, there's plans underway, and you might say, but what I can guarantee you is if I hadn't had the goal, I would have stopped and done this earlier, before I got to the point where I couldn't walk. Okay? Any more comments? Yeah, let's move on from this, right? The last piece of this is about prediction in our reality. This is sort of the caution part. Because it's really summarized, I think, by the Einstein quote, our theories determine what we measure. One of the things that I get back from people sometimes in the PDSA cycle is they get really nervous with articulating a theory and making predictions in the PDSA cycle because they believe that somehow we'll construct our experiments to validate what we believe. And that's a danger. And I think the way a lot of us, the way we look at the world, we have experiences, and from those experiences we get some perception of cause and effect. Now, most of these cycles have been running in our lives since we were tiny. And so these are very well embedded by now, and our perceptions of cause and effect are very defined. And so what happens? Once we've established these, it determines how we see our experiences. So to that extent, I think the Einstein quote is true, that our perceptions of the world determine or color to a large degree what we're able to experience and what data we can see as we have our experiences. And somebody says to me, if you make a prediction, aren't you falling into this trap? And my answer is, you're in the trap already. And I would say if you articulate your predictions and say, this is what we believe will happen, and make them explicit instead of implicit, we're in a better situation to test them. The way Peter Senge says it in the fifth discipline, he talks about mental models, which are like the way the things that shape the way we look at the world. He said mental models aren't a problem. It's when they become tacit, beneath the surface, not visible, that they become a problem. Because then they guide our actions and our thoughts and the data we see without us being aware of that guidance, without us being aware of that. Now, what would we do without them? The mental models in our heads, you can picture them like being like watersheds. You have mountains and hills and things, and watersheds form raindrops into creeks and rivers, and they flow to the ocean, and they're vital. But we need in our minds to be aware that, that we have those watersheds. And maybe we need to try to find ways to make sure that we just don't, by rote, automatically funnel everything the same way. And so what can help us with that? I mean, I think that this is where a system of profound knowledge comes in. 10 years ago, would I have experienced this the same way? Well, 10 years ago, I probably wouldn't hurt myself as bad. I don't know. Would I have had the same learnings in my personal thing with the running? I don't think so. Would these people have had the same learnings with the other examples I've used today? I'm not sure. But I think the system of profound knowledge, the understanding of an appreciation for a system and variation and theory of knowledge and knowledge about psychology integrated as a system, provide us with different questions, which can cause us to examine these. And actually, this is a picture, this is an old slide that I've used. And I'm sorry, but it's not in your materials. Part of the way I think about this is, it's interesting because this central core of theory, test, evaluate, revise, I wrote that down one day, and I realized that, that this is very similar to, the way I perceive the plan, do, study, act cycle. So, I didn't mean to try to pick words that were different than Deming's. I didn't realize that I was doing the same thing as writing down sort of the way I perceive plan, do, study, act. But if we think about plan, do, study, act, it's not always the answer unless it's guided by the system of profound knowledge, which I believe gives us insights on what should we be looking for when we do tests. So it goes back to what I said before. In answering the second question, lots of people only pick their primary dimension of interest, their characteristic that they're primarily interested in. And what a system of profound knowledge should say is, what's the impact on the rest of the system? What issues does variation bring to this? And what does theory of knowledge have to do with this? How's this going to impact people? And, the system of profound knowledge should cause us to be able to ask different questions so that we make these PDSA cycles more instructive. And notice I put experience up here. You know, one of my favorite quotes, and Deming and Ian said it last night. He was talking about, and I don't know if this is from C.I. Lewis. He said, "Learning begins and ends in experience, but it ends in different experience than that in which it began." So I think experience is an important part here, but we need to blend experience with a system of profound knowledge to be asking different questions and be able to gain different insights, and to have some of those raindrops jump to a different watershed, so to speak. So that's my caution, is if you do this and you make predictions, your job is to design a test not to validate your predictions, but to stress them. And some of you may have heard me use this analogy before, but it reminds me of when I was a little kid. And until I had sense enough to stop playing baseball, I was on baseball teams, and my dad was my coach. And my dad was one of those guys that he determined that there was nobody that was going to be able to say that he played favorites. So when he was trying to show people that you had to be brave when you're standing in the batter's box, he'd throw at me, And I was always the last one off the bench. Now, I wasn't one of the better players either. But, he made sure that nobody could ever believe he was playing favorites to me. And I think that we need to be that way a little bit with our predictions and our theories. We need to put them up to the toughest rigors we can, and not presume that they're going to be right, but test them really hard. So, maybe that's not an appropriate analogy, but it helps me to think about it anyway. So that's sort of the caution that I would give you. As you're trying to think about predictions, the idea isn't to predict things and make the world be the way you predict it, but to predict things and then see how the world is so that you can learn from differences. If we think back in our childhood, how many of us remember the stuff that we were always right about? I remember, it's scary, but I remember the answers to some quiz questions that I got wrong in 9th grade earth science. I don't remember any of the ones that I was right about, okay? So going back to the outline, I was compelled to talk with you about prediction today and its role in the model for improvement, its role in being able to predict versus just explain what happens, its role in terms of goals. How do predictions and goals interact? And what are the benefits and maybe problems with goals? And then, let's be careful about understanding predictions in our reality. So the conclusions I would leave you with is use a model for improvement. Make predictions, test the predictions, but do it. Don't just sit around. One of the most compelling things I've heard for a long time is several times I've heard Tom Nolan say, "What's the most instructive cycle you can run tomorrow?" In other words, let's not sit here for months before we start testing anything. Let's run cycles and let's learn from those cycles. So let's apply a model for improvement. Let's answer the 3 questions. Let's use prediction to get at what the theories are so that we can have a basis for learning. So I think so in summary, I think that whether I said it to Dr. Deming or not, I think that it's a good statement. Management isn't just playing games. Management is about prediction. Thank you.